Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming to this ACEA press conference here this afternoon. In just a few moments, I'll hand over to our ACEA CV Board Chairman, Mr. Joachim Drees, who's also the CEO of MAN Truck and Bus, and he will say a few words on the future CO2 standards for heavy-duty vehicles. But before we hand over to Mr. Drees, our Secretary General, Eric Cunard, will just say a few words of welcome.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. A big welcome to all of you at this important fair where you see a lot of great innovations being put on display by all OEMs. We thought it was important also for ACEA, representing all automotive manufacturers for trucks and buses, to also have this press conference, to also provide you with some perspective on how we look at the first ever European Commission proposal introducing CO2 standards for trucks for the first time. So it's an important proposal from the Commission, which we also embrace, but of course we want to use this opportunity to provide you some more detailed perspective, and with that, by way of introduction, I would like to hand over to our President. Yes.
Thank you very much, Eric, for the introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us here today. I think it's quite important that we exchange our views here on CO2 reduction, and I think ACEA, as the representative of the truck industry in that case, is standing on this. Let me just say a few words about some basics about the commercial vehicles, especially trucks. I think simply put, in terms of the work they do, trucks are crucial of keeping our economy and society moving. It's quite interesting when you look into what's happened in Brazil when truck drivers were on strike for 5 or 6 days. Basically, there was no goods nowhere. So you can see this is what we're doing, really. We deliver some 72% of all land-based freight, 72%, and 90% of the total value of goods. So I think it's quite impressive here. And so our importance is actually constantly growing. The performance of road freight transport measured in billion ton kilometers was up by as much as 20% between 2000 and 2016. In terms of emission, of course a big topic, heavy-duty vehicles are responsible for 5% of EU greenhouse gas emissions. So we do 90% of the value of goods, and we do have 5% of the EU greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, the environmental performance of our products is a challenge for our industry, which is taken very seriously for many reasons. And at ACEA members, we all work hard to significantly reduce CO2 emissions from trucks over the past years. This is, of course, driven by our customers, by the customer of our customers, and it's also driven by us. If you reduce CO2, this is also at the same time a competitive advantage, which I think shows how we think in our industry. CO2 emissions is at the core of our thinking. At the same time, with these savings, we have also decreased the pollutant emissions very much, namely NOx, and of course the particulars measures, so the PM. So there's been not only CO2 on the one hand, but also the emissions has been greatly reduced with the last Euro 6 steps more than 85%. Looking ahead, we of course remain committed to further cutting CO2 from road transport, so we are keen to contribute to the development of EU standards for CO2 emissions from trucks. As Eric already mentioned, this is the first time ever that CO2 standards will be introduced for trucks in the EU. Standards for cars, on the other hand, have been in place since 2012. And this is why we feel it is particularly important to draw attention to the specifics of the truck market, which is highly complex. Just look at the roads and look at the trucks you see running around. Almost every truck at least, has some different ways to look differently with its body in particular. Trucks are fundamentally different from passenger cars. They have also wheels, yes, they have an engine, but that's about it. They are not consumer goods, they are business tools, as mentioned before, owned by professionals who are always looking for the best performing vehicle, taking into account, as I mentioned before, fuel assumption and efficiency. This is also why trucks are tailor-made to customer-specific orders or custom-built for a specific mission. Introducing legislation suitable for all different types of trucks is therefore extremely challenging. In other words, we really want to caution policymakers that CO2 standards for heavy-duty vehicles should not follow the same approach as those proposed for cars and vans. I'll now come to some of the key points of the future CO2 legislation, how much CO2 be reduced by and by when. Let me start by stressing that truck manufacturers are willing to commit to ambitious CO2 reductions targets, provided that the reduction level is realistic. Given the state of the truck market and technology today, we believe that 7% CO2 reduction based on 2019 values, we don't even have a baseline today, so by 2019 values, which to have this 7% then included in 2025 is ambitious. Baseline 2019 to be achieved by 25. And this is coming at a high, but we believe also acceptable cost. Let us not forget that this level of reduction will require us to fit new technologies not available yet to vehicles that are actually already on the road or under development, even if this is not originally planned. From an industrial perspective, this is a great and major challenge. In addition to the 2025 target, we support a long-term aspirational CO2 reduction target of 16% by 2030. On the road towards these milestones, we also agree with the need of an interim review in 2022 as proposed by the Commission. However, based on this review, it should be possible to adjust 2030 targets not only upwards but also downwards in order to reflect the realities of the heavy-duty vehicle market at the point in time. This review should, for example, take into account the availability of refueling and charging infrastructure for alternative powered trucks, as well as the market uptake of such vehicles. We all know infrastructure is a big issue which has not been solved yet so far. Here again, the challenges are extremely different than for cars, especially when we consider vehicles and infrastructure for long-haul transport. The review should also reflect the latest information on the fuel performance efficiency of heavy-duty vehicles and, of course, as well as the latest fuel-efficient technologies available on the market by then. Likewise, we believe that any CO2 target must be reviewed in light of potential new Euro standards, so Euro 7 or whatever the standard is at the time. Since reducing pollutant on the one time is in direct conflict with measures to reducing CO2. That has to be absolutely crystal clear. 2025 is just around the corner. Indeed, there are only around 6 years between now and the planned date of implementation of these targets. Given the long product and development cycles of our industry of trucks, vehicles in 2025 are to be delivered to customers. That year is already underway right now. Despite the challenges, this means we still support the objective of introducing CO2 targets in 2025. However, if this is to be achievable, policymakers need to act now. In light of the end of term of the current European Parliament next year, we urge policymakers at the national level to come to a quick political decision on a reasonable solution that can be implemented in a timely manner. Otherwise, we risk major delays in introducing the new targets to the detriment of the environment, as well as the workability of the legislation. But of course, we have to get get it right. It is therefore vital not only to act swiftly, but also to ensure a very robust legislation. This means that the targets need to be in line with what is technologically possible and economically viable. It also means that the framework should provide enough flexibility and the right enabling conditions to make sure that the CO2 targets are deliverable in practice after all. For instance, we welcome the introduction of a super credit system to incentivize the market uptake of low and zero emission trucks. Simply put, when selling such a truck, a manufacturer will be granted super credits that count multiple times towards achieving two specific CO2 targets. However, to ensure that the market for such vehicle can mature in years to come, ACEA believes that there should be no cap on super credits for the 2019 to 2029 period. The definition of low emissions vehicle should also be improved by using grams of CO2 per ton kilometer metric, which better reflects the work done by trucks than the grams of CO2 per kilometer metric proposed by the Commission. As for the proposed banking and borrowing system, we believe that manufacturers should be allowed to use credits within 5 years while obliging them to clear debts within 3 years. We are not against the principle of paying penalties in case of excess emissions, but we are very concerned about the high amounts specified in the current proposal and the way they are calculated. The economic objectives of the penalty system is to encourage manufacturers to reach the CO2 targets by investing in new fuel-efficient technologies rather than paying a fine. The amount of the penalty should be set accordingly in line with technology costs and, again, using the correct metric. ACEA recommends that it is set at 570 euros per grams of CO2 per ton kilometer. A truck cannot be punished for its efficiency. Last but not least, the adoption of other innovations that can reduce CO2 emissions from road transport in a cost-effective way, such as European modular system and truck platooning, should receive more support from the Commission, which should also recognize the potential of all alternative fuels. To conclude, ladies and gentlemen, our industry, the truck industry in Europe, is committed to supporting the European Union's objective to further reducing CO2 emissions from new heavy-duty vehicles. With this in mind, we are calling on policymakers to not only to act swiftly, but also to ensure a robust legislation with properly designed CO2 targets that take into account the complexity of our industry. Thank you very much for your attention, and I think we're open now for Q&A. Thank you.